Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, June 1st, 2022. Today is Sunday, May 29th, 2022, and we are starting the study of the book of Ruth, and then after that we'll continue with Samuel. So tonight I'm going to start with a little bit of overview of Ruth and a little bit of background, but I'm going to jump into Ruth tonight also. Um, to do an overview of Ruth would be to tell the whole story of Ruth, and that's kind of a pointless exercise. Um, the background is Ruth is one of the ancestors of David, and it's obviously, at least in its original form, um, a partly a family history that was then recorded later and possibly edited some more. Um, the original uh, people who told this story, and it was probably an oral story told within the family, may well have been Naomi herself, or Ruth, or Boaz. Um, Somebody from that generation probably did it. And they're the three main actors, so they're the obvious people that, and it may well have been all three of them together that told the original story. Um, One, two, or all three of them. It may have been their children who put it into final oral form. Uh, it's obvious that some of the parts of it were added later to give it context. It has been suggested that possibly uh, David may have been a person who put it into final oral form because he was poetic, and obviously it would be a family story he would know. He's not that many generations from uh, Ruth, and we will get to that when it comes up in the text. Um, it is set in the time of the judges, so everything we talked about in general about the judges and how things were applies to this context. In the original order in the Jewish Bible, it was actually put with the wisdom literature, with uh, Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, those books. When it got translated into the Greek in the Septuagint, they put it with Judges and before Samuel because it matches with Samuel, with the Judges, and it helps lead into Samuel. Uh, some people have tried to force fit it to be the same author as Samuel. Uh, Very unlikely. Samuel, at least major parts of the beginning, were clearly written by Samuel or somebody very close to him, and some of the later parts were probably written by uh, court recorders, either priest or royalty or nobility of Israel uh, in the Saul to David period, maybe even multiple scribes in that period. Very unlikely that they were the authors of it. Now, they may have been the first people to write it down. Um, as such, it's very likely that some of David's sons that were in the court, but not in line for the being the king, were probably the people who actually recorded it into writing for the first time. But recording family history into writing might well have been, not a court function, but something they did as well-to-do men that had connections. And hey, we have this cool story in our family, and people need to know, and we're going to record it. And just because I'm making a good living, and this is of interest to me, and so I'm going to record this family story. Very likely, um, the author, whether you take that to be the person who did the oral story or the person who put it into writing, um, clearly has the viewpoint that God is directing history, and that even though um, there's no mention of a prophet saying "Thus saith the Lord," or um, you know that it nowhere explicitly in the text does it say you know uh, God was directing this. It's very obvious from the story that God is directing this. He's directing history. He's the unseen hand, um, and uh, by analogy, uh, the whole nation is therefore guided by God's unseen hand. Um, the big that's kind of the big picture part of it here. Very likely, you had this kind of development where there is a oral author that told the story the first time, told through a series of storytellers, um, probably most of them having memorized the original version and maybe editorialized it a little bit as they went along, but it probably arrives into David's court essentially intact. And then when it gets recorded on paper for the first time, well, in writing for the first time, they didn't have paper yet, but then there were some other things added to it to help people understand. Um, and we're going to talk about those possible additions as you go along, because the original storyteller would not have needed to explain certain things. Um, but obviously, when it was written down, they got added because the culture had changed enough that it needed to be told. And this is a pivotal point in history. The um, the problems of the period of Judges has become a dominant cultural problem. There's some serious problems. People aren't really following God as king, and they aren't following the priest and what the priest tell them. And even the priesthood is becoming corrupt. We will, when we get to Samuel, we'll look at that more. But that's kind of background. Um, this is just kind of a personal saga. It doesn't deal with the grand scheme of things, but in the milieu it's in, the Israelites know they have this problem, that they're not consistent following God, and people do what they feel like doing, what they want to do, as we saw stated several times in Judges. Um, every man did what he thought was right in his own eyes because there was no king in Israel. And that's not just saying there's no monarchy, but even the Israelites that should be seeing God as king don't see God as king and don't follow him. So, and because of that, as they fall away as a culture, God punishes them. They get defeated. They get famine. They get captured in war. They get pestilence, etc., etc. All these problems, and they get bad leadership. And then when they repent, then God sends them a savior who is, both theological and political, and they come back to God, and then, they worship God again. And that is the context that Ruth is in. Um, very soon they're going to adopt a new system. And we'll get into that in Samuel because Samuel's the key uh, figure that changes from the time of the judges to the time of the monarchy. And he's pivotal in all the major people involved. Um, and he's the last judge, he's the first prophet. Uh, he acts as priest, even though he's not of the priestly line. We'll get to that in Samuel. Um, and so there's this turning point um, in Samuel that shifts the culture in major ways, and they become a monarchy instead of a confederation. Um, at the time of the judges, they're basically a confederation. They're they're definitely tribal, and there's 12 tribes, 13 tribes if you count it correctly, actually. The Levites is a separate tribe. And but within those tribes, they're clans. And the different clans see a connection with each other that they're closer together than clans from a different tribe. And the tribes function as almost as independent little nations. And sometimes even the clans within the tribes function as independent little nations. There's some common cultural things, there's some common religious things between all the clans, between all the tribes, but there's no unity, and and there's no mechanism for unity other than everybody goes to worship at Shiloh, at the tabernacle, where the priests are, and therefore the Levite tribe and the Aaronic priest are supposed to be in charge, except nobody obeys them. And because there's nothing to unify them except this worship of Yahweh, and that's only sporadic and incoherent reality, they continually have problems, and the people around them after they've conquered the land are actually very much tribal and clannish and loose confederations of tribes. The Philistines are actually the first group that get their act back together and become a nation. And they had 5 different cities, and originally there were 5 city-states, and they formed this confederation, and they found the confederation doesn't work, and they become a monarchy with 5 the 5 mayors of the 5 cities, and as the ruling council, and one of them gets promoted to monarchy, but his son doesn't necessarily follow him. The son becomes the mayor of the city he came from, and is sitting on the monarchy council, um, and so they become unified because they have these, from their viewpoint, very barbarous people trying to overtake their land, the Israelites. And so they have to unify. They can't count on Egypt to back them up because the Egyptians don't care about them. And the other Canaanites have basically been effectively wiped out. The Hittites are too far away and don't care about them. The Moabites don't care about them. The Edomites don't care about them. The other people groups in the area don't care about them and are all far away too. And so they have to do this on their own, and that's why they unify. Well, the Israelites, when confronted with this unified national government, the Philistines now have a problem. And we saw part of that in Judges. Samuel actually does a great number to break them back. And keep them from overwhelming the Israelites. Um, he and that's why he's important. But the Israelites realize they have a problem, and we're not going to deal with that till we get to Samuel, because Samuel deals with that problem and the cultural change it makes. But I point that out because Ruth, at least the oral history, was recorded in the time of the judges, and people would understood the story. It was the culture they were in. By the time it got written down, the culture had shifted, and some of these practices had been discontinued, and people didn't understand them anymore, and so they had to be recorded and explained, because even though it's 3 or 4 generations later, the people don't understand them anymore. And so you, at least the old folks that recorded it, understood what the old customs were, and so recorded them specifically so people would understand. Um, and that actually gets us a snapshot of these customs kind of at the end of the Judges. We had seen snapshots of these, some of these customs in Genesis and in Judges, and we find when we compare those passages, actually they were a kind of a fluid tradition. Yeah, they kept the same name, they had the same basic social purpose, but exactly how they functioned had changed through the years. Case law had happened, and it was a little different than it was at the beginning. And so when it gets recorded in the monarchy that this is the old system that's gone away, they recorded the final version. And we'll get into that as we get into Ruth. So let's start in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judea, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. I'm going to pause there just a moment. This is obviously added by the person who recorded it on paper for the first time, or wrote it down for the first time. I keep saying on paper. They didn't have paper, but you recorded it, wrote it down. He knows that he needs to put this context in, because if it just starts with verse 2, the man's name was Elimelech, the people around him don't understand that context of the judges. They're in a monarchy. The period of the judges is just past history that they don't understand. They weren't there. And so they need to know. And the context of a famine. Okay, they still had famines under the kings. But because it's a unified country, it actually was very rare for the famine to be countrywide. Most of those got recorded in history of the Samuel or Kings or Chronicles, because they were viewed as judgment of God. Up until the monarchy, though, you could have a local famine where, this county has a famine, and because there was no national unification, the county over, this clan has a famine, that the clan next door, well, we don't like you anyway, and why should we sell you our food? Famine may come here next, and then we won't have. And besides, we got good friends over that way, and we're making good trade with them. Get your friends to sell you food. The people you've intermarried with, and some of the clans could be kind of left out, and that's apparently what happened here. It's not a wide-scale famine. It's not a famine that's Countrywide, it may be a famine in a clan, a famine in a tribe. It may have been just a famine in Bethlehem. Um, you know, we don't know. The context is not given. It was not recorded in the oral history that passed down to the person who wrote it down. So it's not. It's been lost by the time it gets written down. And but in the context of the judges, where people quit worshiping Yahweh and then had uh, God visit judgment on them, and famine was one of those judgments God put on them. The implication is the people in Bethlehem have quit worshiping Yahweh correctly, and therefore God has sent a local famine, and they're hurting. And Elimelech and his family are now refugees, and they choose to go to Moab. Um, we know a little bit about Elimelech. He actually did worship Yahweh. Um, why he went to Moab instead of somewhere else within Israel where people worshipped um, Yahweh, we don't know. Um, we know he worshipped Yahweh because Naomi and Ruth worshipped Yahweh. And we're going to talk about that just a little bit more, hopefully tonight, as we get to it. Time is running. Um, but we don't know why Moab. It could be that Elimelech looked around and goes, "Yeah, we're in famine, but everybody else is hurting, and they can't take a refugee wherever I can see." And he may have had business contacts in Moab. He may have done business with Moab all the time, so knew somebody there that was quite willing to benefit him and take him in as a refugee. Um, we know that during the time of the judges, the Israelites did trade with the surrounding countries. They did interact with them. Um, and so, you know, apparently Elimelech knew something about Moab and went there. Moab was actually a country that had less agricultural production than Israel did. So they normally bought food from Israel. That they were better off and had more food is indicating something that God was probably affecting the whole country. Um, they may have still had more food per acre, but had more people, and therefore had famine at a higher agricultural production. Moab being lower populated, um, it was less productive, but they had a lower population. They may not have been as hurt by the famine and therefore had more food per people to be able to benefit. Uh, but you know, that's all in some sense speculation. Elimelech, for whatever reason, took his family and went to Moab. Um, his sons were not old enough to be considered men yet. They were still children. He and his wife and his two sons went to go. Verse 2. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judea, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah, and the other Ruth. Because they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her two sons and her husband. So, you know, a really quick summary of the events. They stay there a considerable length of time. The sons grow up, they become men. Her husband dies. Naomi finds local wives for them. She intermarries into the local community. Um, she has effectively decided she's going to become Moabite, and their family's going to become Moabite. She's not going back home to Israel. Um, she's basically left Israel as refugees. Um, uh, that's a very common history story worldwide. Refugees go to some new place, and even if conditions approve, they very often have built new lives in the new place, and they may consider themselves from that place, but they don't go back home, even when conditions improve. Even if conditions improve at home more than they are where they are, they have a life. They're not going to uproot again. They're tired of being uprooted. Um, I'm going to say Naomi was tired of being uprooted. She'd done it once. She didn't want to do it again. And God's going to force her hand. Her husband dies. She has her sons marry into the locals. And obviously, she's not forming a Elimelech clan or a Naomi clan. They become part of the clans of the Moabites that they live among. They've married into those clans, and they're just sons-in-law living among the Moabites in those clans. And then even the sons die. God is trying to force Naomi back into Israel. And she's putting her in a place where she will consider the disruption of moving back and being a refugee somewhere else again. That's got to be quite traumatic. Um, you got to feel for Naomi. She's suffered a lot. She's been widowed, and now she has no more sons. And she's the matriarch of a very small clan that is fixing to die out if it doesn't find some men to marry the women. You know, she's in a world of hurt here. Verse 6. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there. With her two daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So they originally are going to go back to Naomi's home. Orpah and Ruth are going to follow their mother-in-law. They are going to effectively leave their clans. They could, by the tradition of the people there, go back to their father's house and to their clan as widows and say, hey, take us back. And they would be part of the clan taken in. And but the initial choice is they're going to follow Naomi. That says something about how the people viewed marriage is when you married into somebody else's family. The women became part of the men's family. And they were so used to that if Naomi's going back, we're going back. It wasn't back for them, but we're going back because we're part of Naomi's family. If she's going back to her family, we're going back to her family too, because it's our family. That's how they were thinking. And verse 8, then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have been shown to your dad and to me. May the Lord grant each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, We will go back with you to your people. This, it shows how committed they were. Both of them were committed to their mother in law. They viewed themselves as part of her family, not part of the family they had come from. That is kind of the way all the part of the Middle East at that time viewed uh, women, and how that when you married into another family, you just became part of that family, and you were part of that family for life. And so Orpah and Ruth were saying, "Hey, we're going with you." Even though Naomi is trying to get them to go back to their people, to their home. And that was allowed, that widows could go back to their clan of origin, their family of origin, and live there. But it was kind of a black mark. You became almost unmarriable in a lot of those cultures. Um, you know, Men would wonder, am I going to die too? They're kind of superstitious. They didn't want to marry somebody that was so cursed that none of the men lived. Marry his brother. Oh, wait, his brother's dead. No, we don't want you. That's kind of the view. And so she's urging him to go back. They say, no, we're going with you. Verse 11. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who will become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. So she's just pointing out the simple logic. Uh, she probably thinks she's at menopause or later. She's not going to be able to bear children. Even should she instantly get a husband and bear a son, it's going to be, 12, 13 years before they're able to be married. And these are adult women. Um, you know, um, they're probably in their 20s. They're going to wait another, 12, 13, 14, 15 years for a baby to be born and then finally be able to marry this husband. And even then, would that boy want to marry this woman that's, 20 something years older than him? Um, you know, we have in the history of the Israelites trouble with that kind of thing too. That the younger son is like, no, I don't want this one. I don't want to be forced into this. So, she's pointing out to him just some simple logic. If you go back with me, you're going to just be the daughter-in-law of a woman that can't have sons, and even if I did, you couldn't wait that long to be married to my sons. You're going to be widows the rest of your life. No chance for having a family. No chance for anybody to support you. You have no hope, no chances. And if you go back to your parents, there's a chance that they'll be wealthy enough that somebody will want to marry into the clan bad enough to have you. You know, and that's kind of the logic she's using on them. Verse 14. At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, I'm going to stop before I get 16. Orpah understands the logic and agrees with it and says, okay, I I'm your family, but I understand, and it's better to be back with my family. Um, the implication in what's said here, she's going back to her gods, which means the implication is Elimelech and Naomi and Bethlon and Kilion still worshipped Yahweh and had taught their wives to worship Yahweh. And they were worshiping Yahweh there in Moab. And, that says something about Malon and Kilion, the two sons, that they had taught their wives to worship Yahweh. I'm going to say that Orpah, being Malhon's wife, I'm going to say Malhon, even though he's the older son, he did not convince his wife to worship Yahweh in such a way but what she's willing to go back to her family and worship the gods she grew up with. And we're going to learn in 16, Ruth was different. And so I'm going to give Kilion props for that. He convinced his wife in such a convincing way that she is convinced that Yahweh is real and should be worshipped, and she's not going back to those old false gods. So verse 16. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So, and by the way, this passage is used lots of places and lots of ways for, um, Ruth's devotion to Naomi, Ruth's love for Naomi, and those things are there. But underlying it all is Ruth trust Yahweh enough that no matter the circumstances, she's not going back to her people and to the old gods she no longer believes in. She's willing to risk it all to worship Yahweh. That's kind of an important point, and that's why I give Kilion points. He has so convinced his wife that Yahweh is real and alive and the only God, and all the other gods are false, that she's not willing to go back to worshiping a false God just to have an economic life and have a family. And she's willing to go be the refugee in Israel. That's how convinced she is. And she says it in very lovely, poetic language, yes. Obviously a very intelligent woman, well versed in constructing language. And she's convincing. Naomi believes her. And she makes this commitment to go back and be part of Elimelech's clan back in Judah, and to worship Elimelech's God in Judah. She's not willing to give that up. She wants to. And that's a very key part of who Ruth is and why she's important. If you understood the Mosaic law correctly, a descendant of a Moabite should not enter the tabernacle for 10 generations. That's long enough you lose track of it. You were basically excluded forever, because who would keep up with it for that long just to worship Yahweh? I mean, in that length of time, some of those generations are going to go, forget this, we're going back to Moab. We pick up their gods. Nobody cares. um, if we, 2 or 3 generations, or 5 or 10 or 8, worshipped and lived in this land, we go back and be, you know, when you have polytheists, so what? um, you know, so you were not supposed to. Yet she is dedicated to Yahweh and says, no, I'm going to go live where people of Yahweh are. And I'm dedicated to you. You're my mother-in-law, and you're more important to me than my family of origin. And that is intense love. I'm intense devotion. I'm not going to say it's not. But underlying that is that she has converted to worshiping Yahweh. And one of the big points, big things is the people of Israel and even the priests were not so legalistic at this point in time that they rejected Ruth. If she worshipped Yahweh and truly converted, they were willing to accept her as Yahweh worshiper and part of Israel. You married in, you believed enough to be a refugee among us, you're accepted. So it's not only Naomi that accepts her, it's the community that Naomi comes to that accepts her and they accept her as an Israelite, even though she has no Israelite lineage, no Israelite genetics. She was married to an Israelite, but she worships Yahweh, and that's the important characteristic that they pick up on, and that she genuinely worships Yahweh, and so they accept her. And Naomi realizes this, and she quits urging her to. And she quits fighting her on it. And verse 19. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Let's face it, it's been over 10 years. She's aged, she's changed. That was a day and time when 10 years was probably a quarter of your life. And, you know, a quarter of your life, you change immensely. And let's face it, she left with a husband and 2 sons. She comes back with herself and this stranger. So the townspeople that think they may know her going, "Are you really Naomi? Is this really? You kind of look like her. You sound like her. You claim to be her. Are you? You know, really? Can this be? Really? Is it? Is it?" You know, there was no ID cards or anything like that. There was no documentation to prove you are who you say you are. Just the people have to look at you and go, "Yeah, we think that's what the person we knew as Naomi when she left would look like when she's aged that many years. Do you know the things that Naomi should know?" And you know, so they're questioning, you know, are you really Naomi? And if you are, well, you know, why are you here? Why didn't you stay there? Why didn't you go back to the family that you married into, your son's married into? Why'd you bring the daughter-in-law back? You know, there are all kinds of things here. Is she really part of our clan? We've never met her before, you know. And there was probably racial differences that they could recognize, and they go, "Yeah, well, look, she's a Moabite. She's not one of us." That's the kind of whispering you can see in the background. Verse 20. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Now, Naomi uh, means pleasant. That's literally what the word means. She was named Pleasant. Her parents thought she was going to be a pleasant person, and she's lived this life that was pleasant. But she's gone, followed her husband, and he's died, and she's married her two sons off, and they've died, and she's coming back as a refugee for the second time in her life. And she says, "Don't call me Pleasant anymore. Call me Mara." Mara meant bitter. She's changed her name as she comes back from pleasant to bitter. Her life is bitter. She's a widow. Um, she has this young woman with her that she's got to support as a widow. Widows had no economic authority and economic power. Um, her daughter-in-law is a widow. They're going to be destitute, even in Israel, even in Judah, even in their clan. They're going to be destitute. They're going to be the poorest of the poor. She knows that men own property. She's not going to own any property. She can't go move back into her whole old house. She can't start farming her old garden. She can't start farming the old farm. Somebody else owns it. Even if it's unused, she can't go back into it. So she knows she's destitute and two mouths to feed. Her life is bitter. And she reflects that in her name change. And she tells the people, and this is part of what convinces them, yeah, she's Naomi. They accept her as Naomi. The rest of the story, everybody refers to her as Naomi. To them, she's still pleasant. Her life is bitter. It's been tough. And she wants to be called bitter. But God is still working behind the scenes. And she's going to become pleasant again. Even though right now, things are very bitter for her. Verse 21, she continues this saying, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arrived in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And they arrived back. This is late summer. Barley has gotten ripe. It's time to harvest it. It's a fortunate time to come back because it's a time people are going to start to be generous. The harvest has started. They're no longer having to live on last year's produce and the vegetables you can grow right now. So when the harvest is in, if the harvest is abundant, they're going to be willing to give to the destitute a little bit. Hopefully enough to keep you alive all year. It's a good time to come. The barley harvest was the first harvest of the year. And so, if harvest is really good, they have a real chance of being given enough charity they can make it a year, eating and cooking and, become established in the community. If they'd come in at the end of harvest or at the end of planting, nobody would have anything to give them. They would have just been, absolutely destitute. But during the harvest, they had a chance. So Naomi has this chance that she can start over. Now, I do think Naomi was wise enough to know that, and that's part of why she arrived back then. She didn't plan her journey so she should get home at the wrong time of year. She got there at the right time of year to get charity and to get accepted. Um, I think she's that kind of wise. Um, she is still trusting God, even though she's um, in a kind of a backhanded way accusing God of being cruel to her. She's still putting her faith in Yahweh. Uh, Her life has been cruel and treated her cruelly, but she's still coming back to Yahweh's people, uh, putting her faith in Yahweh, that Yahweh will tend to her. And she's kind of depending upon the um, graciousness of the clan to accept her back. And she's coming back at the right time of year to do that. So even though she's at her low point and she's at her most bitter, she's actually at the bottom. Things are going to look up. And we're going to leave it there for a week. And we'll start back at chapter 2, verse 1 next week. Gracious Lord, have us to understand your graciousness in how you deal with us in dealing with Ruth and Naomi and what happened then. That you work in circumstances of life, even if somebody doesn't point out, you know, this is God working. You're still working. You worked in Naomi's family, and you worked in Ruth's life and blessed her. And it's important that Ruth, who Ruth was in the history, that you are a gracious God, that you're accepting, that if people worship you, you will accept them. Thank you for being that kind of gracious, that kind of merciful, that the rules are there to keep us from falling away from you. But if we break the rules in such a way as to follow you, you still forgive us and let's move on and worship you. Lord, have us to put our faith in you the way Ruth did, wholeheartedly, enough to go be a refugee and be destitute with no knowledge that she would ever be married again, have a family, be anything but just destitute for the rest of her life. And yet, you're going to be gracious to her. Have us to have that kind of faith too. In your almighty name, amen. And I hope to see you Wednesday at Bible study. If not, I hope to see you Sunday. But if nothing else, we'll see you here on YouTube. Have a blessed week.